December 14, 1861. This was not merely the day Prince Albert died, it was the day the world broke for Queen Victoria. In the Blue Room at Windsor Castle, a foul stench of sickness and despair hung in the air. Albert, ravaged by what was likely typhoid fever, lay gasping his final, ragged breaths. Victoria, who had been a queen since she was a girl, was now reduced to a primal, keening animal. She clung to his hand, her body convulsing with sobs, begging a god she was about to renounce to spare him. When his breathing finally ceased, a silence fell upon the room, a silence so absolute, so heavy, it felt like the end of all things. But this was not a moment of quiet sorrow. It was a detonation. The Queen's mind, once a fortress of regal duty, fractured into a million pieces. Her first words as a widow were not of state or succession. They were a hollow, chilling whisper. "There is no one left to call me Victoria." She had ceased to be a person. She was now just a relic, an echo of a love so total that its absence was a black hole consuming everything. The physicians and courtiers who witnessed her collapse were not looking at a grieving wife. They were looking at the epicenter of a psychological earthquake that would send tremors across the world for the next 4 decades. They led her from the room, a zombie in a crown, leaving behind a cold body and the ghost that would rule an empire. In the immediate aftermath, Victoria's grief mutated into something far more sinister, a meticulously crafted delusion. She did not preserve Albert's memory, she denied his death. This denial became a grotesque, daily ritual that turned the royal palaces into living tombs. Every morning, a valet would enter Prince Albert's bedroom, just as he had for years. He would bring a bowl of hot water for shaving and lay out a fresh razor. Every evening, Albert's formal dinner clothes would be laid upon the bed, his cufflinks and watch placed precisely on the nightstand. His chamber pot was emptied and cleaned. The room was kept in a state of perpetual readiness, as if the prince had merely stepped out for a walk and was expected back at any moment. This macabre theater was not optional. It was a royal decree. Servants who failed in this ghostly duty faced the full force of the Queen's unhinged wrath. But it gets so much more bizarre. Victoria began sleeping with a plaster cast of Albert's hand, clutching the cold, dead weight to her chest through the night. At the dinner table, a full place setting was laid for the prince consort. A servant would stand behind his empty chair. Victoria would often turn and speak to the chair, her voice filled with a desperate tenderness, consulting the ghost of her husband on matters great and small, while her horrified children stared at their plates, trapped in their mother's waking nightmare. This wasn't mourning, it was a cult with a congregation of one, and its god was a ghost who lived in an empty room. Victoria's obsession soon required a temple. The royal mausoleum at Frogmore, a magnificent domed structure she and Albert had designed together, became the new, dark heart of the British monarchy. It was no longer a place of rest, it was her real throne room. While the halls of Buckingham Palace fell silent and dusty, the cold, damp air of the crypt became the Queen's preferred atmosphere. She would spend hours inside, often several times a day, surrounded by polished marble and the suffocating scent of lilies. She would kneel before Albert's sarcophagus, a massive granite block, and speak to it for hours on end. Her daughters, forced to accompany her, would shiver in the bone-chilling cold, watching their mother pour out her soul to a block of stone. She read him letters, updated him on family gossip, and sought his counsel on political crises. To the outside world, she was the Widow of Windsor, a title that suggested dignified seclusion. The reality was far more grotesque. She was the Queen of the Dead, a modern-day Persephone who had willingly descended into the underworld and refused to leave. The business of a global empire, of politics, of progress, of life itself, was being conducted from the edge of a grave. She was communicating not with her ministers, but with a stone effigy, convinced that if she just spoke long enough, earnestly enough, the stone would eventually speak back. A monarch cannot rule from a tomb. As Victoria retreated deeper into her morbid fantasy, the British Empire, the largest and most powerful entity on the planet, was suddenly rudderless. Her refusal to perform public duties was not a brief period of mourning, it was a decade-long abdication of responsibility. She refused to open Parliament. She refused to attend state dinners, to review troops, to be seen by the people who were, in theory, her subjects. The face of the monarchy, once a symbol of stability, had vanished. In its place was a void, an unnerving silence that bred contempt and dissent. This was not a private matter. It was a catastrophic political crisis. Republican movements, once a fringe idea, gained terrifying momentum. Pamphlets and newspapers began to openly ask, "What is the use of a queen we never see? Why pay for a monarch who does nothing?" The institution of the monarchy itself began to rot from the head down. Her own ministers were in a state of perpetual panic. Prime Minister William Gladstone would write desperate, pleading letters, begging her to return to public life, warning her that her absence was doing irreparable damage. She ignored them. In her mind, the stability of her empire was a trivial concern compared to the stability of her conversations with a corpse. The Queen's grief was no longer a personal tragedy. It had become a disease infecting the body politic, and the prognosis was dire. Into this vacuum of power, this abyss of royal neglect, stepped one of the most unlikely and disruptive figures in British history. John Brown. He was not a prince, not a politician, not even a gentleman. He was a coarse, hard-drinking, aggressively blunt Scottish gillie, a hunting guide and stableman from the Highlands. To the prim and proper royal court, he was a walking, breathing insult. He smelled of whiskey and horses, his boots were caked in mud, and his manners were non-existent. And he became the most powerful man in England. Victoria, isolated in her grief at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, found in Brown something she couldn't find in anyone else, a brutal, unfiltered connection to what she believed was Albert's spirit. Albert had admired the rugged honesty of the Highlanders, and in Brown, Victoria saw not a servant, but a living relic of her husband's affection. Brown, for his part, seemed to understand that the normal rules of deference no longer applied. He did not bow or scrape. He treated the Queen of England with a shocking, almost contemptuous familiarity. He gave her orders. He chided her for her self-pity. He called her, simply, woman. And Victoria, to the absolute horror of her court and family, did not punish his insolence. She rewarded it. She craved it. This stableman was about to become the master of the Queen's soul. The relationship between Victoria and John Brown was never about simple friendship or service. It was rooted in something far stranger and more terrifying, the supernatural. Victoria became utterly convinced that John Brown was a natural medium, a human conduit through which the spirit of her beloved Albert could speak. Brown, whether through cynical manipulation or a shared delusion, played the part to perfection. During their long, isolated walks through the Scottish mist, he would relay messages from the prince. These were not vague platitudes. They were specific instructions, opinions, and reassurances that mirrored Albert's personality with uncanny accuracy. This culminated in secret, private séances held in the dead of night at Balmoral and Windsor. These were not the elaborate theatrical events of public spiritualism. They were raw, intimate, and deeply disturbing. Picture the scene: the Queen of England, draped in mourning black, sitting in a dimly lit room. Opposite her sits the brutish Highlander, his eyes closed, his rough voice taking on a different cadence as he begins to channel the dead prince consort. He would speak of private memories only Victoria and Albert could have known. He would offer guidance on her children and on matters of state. For Victoria, this was not a performance. It was a holy communion. She wrote in her coded diaries that when Brown was near, she felt Albert's dear, strong arm around her. The psychological takeover was complete. The Queen was no longer taking advice from a servant, she was taking orders from a ghost speaking through him. While Victoria found solace in her spectral conversations, her own children saw only a horror show. They were not just witnessing their mother's breakdown, they were being held hostage by it. Her eldest son and heir, Bertie, the future King Edward VII, was particularly horrified. He saw John Brown not as a spiritual guide, but as a manipulative, alcoholic peasant who had bewitched his mother and usurped his own father's place. The court referred to Brown with sneering contempt as the Queen's Stallion, a crude nickname that hinted at the dark, unspeakable rumors about the true nature of their intimacy. Bertie and his siblings were powerless. To question their mother's relationship with Brown was to question her sanity, an act of lèse-majesté they dared not commit. They were forced to watch as this stableman was given privileges far beyond his station. He controlled access to the Queen. He was given his own house, his own servant, and his portrait was commissioned by Victoria herself. He would openly berate the Prince of Wales in front of the Queen, and she would do nothing. The family dynamic became a grotesque parody of itself, the children of a queen forced into a subservient role to a man they considered to be their mother's puppet master, or worse. They were trapped, forced to participate in the delusion, knowing that the stability of the monarchy rested on their silence. Victoria's obsession with the afterlife was not confined to John Brown. It metastasized, drawing in other, even more disturbing figures. She became a voracious consumer of spiritualist literature and an active seeker of mediums. The most shocking instance of this was when she invited a 13-year-old boy, Robert James Lees, to Buckingham Palace. This child claimed he was one of the most powerful mediums in England, capable of summoning spirits on demand. The queen of a global empire, the ruler of hundreds of millions, sat in a darkened room, holding hands with a teenager, begging him to bring her husband back. According to Lees's own accounts, which he published years later, the séances were a terrifying success. He claimed the ghost of Prince Albert not only appeared but gave Victoria direct and specific political advice. The spirit, speaking through the boy, allegedly warned her against certain alliances, endorsed specific ministers, and offered strategies for dealing with European conflicts. Whether Lees was a charlatan or genuinely believed his own claims is irrelevant. The horrifying reality is that the Queen believed him. For a time, the foreign policy of the British Empire was being influenced by what a pubescent boy claimed a ghost was telling him in a dark room. The government was in a state of quiet terror. They were no longer dealing with a grieving widow, they were dealing with a monarch whose grip on reality had slipped so completely that she was outsourcing decisions of state to the spirit world. The whispers about Victoria and John Brown were relentless and they were foul. Did their relationship cross the ultimate line? Was the Empress of India sleeping with her Scottish servant? The rumor became one of the great unspoken scandals of the 19th century. While concrete proof remains elusive, buried in the pages of the diaries her daughter Beatrice censored and burned, the circumstantial evidence was damning. Victoria's devotion to him was total, far exceeding that of a mere friend or servant. She gave him a ring on the 4th anniversary of Albert's death, a gesture laden with marital symbolism. One of Victoria's chaplains, the Reverend Norman MacLeod, wrote a deathbed confession claiming he had been coerced into performing a secret marriage ceremony between the Queen and John Brown. While the confession is debated by historians, its very existence speaks to the sheer plausibility of the affair in the minds of those who witnessed it. Whether physical or not, the emotional and psychological intimacy was absolute. Brown was, for all intents and purposes, her surrogate husband. He was the only one who could command her, comfort her, and connect her to the ghost she worshipped. The scandal was not necessarily about sex. It was about a catastrophic transgression of class, power, and royal decorum that revealed the depths of the Queen's desperate, all-consuming need. In 1883, the unthinkable happened. The medium died. John Brown, after a lifetime of hard living and heavy drinking, succumbed to a severe bout of erysipelas. For Victoria, his death was a second widowhood, a catastrophe almost on the scale of Albert's passing. The channel to the spirit world had gone silent. Her grief was explosive and terrifying. She wrote in her diary, "The shock is awful, I am utterly crushed." She immediately began planning a biography of Brown, a hagiography that would have elevated him to the status of a national hero. Her private secretary, Sir Henry Ponsonby, was so horrified by the project, knowing it would expose the full, insane depth of the Queen's obsession and permanently disgrace the monarchy, that he conspired with the Dean of Windsor to have it suppressed. Victoria commissioned statues of Brown. She had fresh flowers placed on his pillow every day. She behaved as if she had lost not a servant, but a king. But this second grief did not cure her of her affliction. Instead, it revealed the true nature of her pathology. She was not devoted to John Brown the man, she was addicted to the function he served. He was a vessel for her connection to the afterlife. And now that the vessel was broken, she would, with a terrifying swiftness, begin the search for another. The silence was unbearable, and she would fill it, no matter the cost. The Queen did not have to wait long. In 1887, for her Golden Jubilee, 2 Indian servants were sent to England as a ceremonial gift. One of them was a handsome, charismatic 24-year-old named Abdul Karim. Within months, the pattern began to repeat itself with chilling precision. Victoria, now an old woman, latched onto Karim with the same ferocious intensity she had shown for John Brown. She dismissed his lowly origins and elevated him to a position of unprecedented power and intimacy. He was no longer her servant, he was her munshi, or teacher. He taught her Hindustani. He cooked her spicy curries, which she adored. And most importantly, he spoke to her of a culture and a spirituality that was alien and exotic, another conduit to a world beyond her own. The royal household watched in a state of horrified déjà vu as Karim was given his own cottage, his own staff, and brought his entire extended family to live on the royal estates. He was given access to secret state papers. He traveled with her everywhere. The racial and class anxieties of the court exploded. They saw Karim as an even more dangerous charlatan than Brown. But Victoria was deaf to their warnings. In Karim, she had found her new medium, a new connection to the exotic and the unknown, a new shield against the crushing loneliness of her reality. The ghost of Albert now wore a new face, but the haunting was exactly the same. Queen Victoria's death in 1901 was not an end, but the final macabre act of her 40-year obsession. Her funeral was a meticulously planned event she had obsessed over for decades, and its details reveal everything about her shattered psyche. It was not the funeral of a British monarch, it was the ritual of a high priestess preparing to join her lost god. By her explicit, non-negotiable command, her coffin was not just to contain her body. It was to be a treasure chest of her demons and her desires. Into the coffin with her went a white satin dress and her wedding veil, the bride she longed to be again. On her right side, her attendants placed the plaster cast of Prince Albert's hand that had been her nightly companion for 4 decades. They placed one of his dressing gowns over her body, a final, spectral embrace. But it was the instruction for her left side that was the most shocking, a secret she had kept until the very end. Her physicians were ordered to place in her left hand a photograph of John Brown and a lock of his hair, which she had kept in a hidden case. She was to be buried for eternity, wedged between the 2 men who had defined her life, her husband and his medium, her god and his ghost. The most powerful woman in the world went to her grave not as a queen, but as a ghost bride, eternally reaching for a hand that wasn't there. Her legacy was not the empire, it was the longest and most tragic ghost story ever told.